Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannick, and you can support this podcast by sharing this episode on social media. You can go to our Instagram or Facebook page and share this post or share them directly from our website, hopefortheanimalspodcast.org. Stories are so important. I really feel that stories help us to feel the weight of an issue or a situation, to bring our hearts into the subject matter. And our guest today, JH Burnett, has some really profound stories from his time in the farmed animal industry that he has shared with me. And they are so powerful. Vegans are sometimes accused of not knowing what we're talking about because we haven't worked on a farm. Well, JH has. And for years, he witnessed the reality in the sheep and dairy industries. And he is now telling his story so everyone can know the truth. But before we get into the interview, I wanted to briefly talk about something that I feel is important and I have some thoughts on, and that's the EATS Act that is working its way through legislation here in the US. So, the EATS Act is this sweeping piece of legislation that's designed to prevent state and local jurisdictions from regulating agricultural products within their borders. So, under this act, any law that's in place in states like state animal welfare laws, food safety laws, these hard won laws over many years will basically be wiped out. The language in this act is so disturbing. They talk about, quote, pre harvest condition agricultural products, meaning live animals, right? So we've seen this attempt before by ag with the King Amendment, but that failed. That was a couple of years ago. But this is an updated version. And from what I'm reading, it actually has a possibility of passing, which is really awful. There's even talk of including it in the Farm Bill, which would be detrimental. So if this thing passed, it would basically wipe out the very minimal improvements that are in place for animals, these rules and laws like extreme confinement for animals, banning gestation crates for sows, rules like chickens having to have at least 1 square foot of living space. And that's one of the laws in Colorado. And I mean, these laws are really so incredibly minimal, but at least it is something. And then there's more significant ones. Like in California, there is a ban on foie gras, which is the force feeding of ducks and geese with a plastic or metal pipe shoved down their throat. That ban on foie gras could be eliminated. So this EATS Act would take away all this work, all these laws. And we're talking about many years of activist hours, millions of dollars, vast amounts of organizations, resources, and time and energy. It's horrible. So I worked on legislative efforts back in the day, years ago, but I decided that it wasn't where I wanted to spend my time. I felt it wasn't the most effective path. It wasn't the best use of my time. But what I want to say about this EATS Act, is that it really shows how fragile legislation is. I know that as an animal advocacy movement, we have been putting a lot of eggs in the cage free egg basket. And we now put a lot of our energy and money towards passing legislation. But the possibility of this act passing, it just shows how fragile this strategy is. And it's yet another reason that I feel that we just shouldn't be so heavily focused on welfare reforms as a movement. They're just too easy to overturn. It's too easy for the industry to get around these laws and these rules. And if we don't address the underlying issue of speciesism, the ethical consideration for all animals, these hard-won efforts, they're just too easily reversed. as long as there is demand for animal products. We have to change our habits, our desires, our views of non human animals as commodities. They're not products. Their bodies and secretions are not food. They are living, sentient beings. And we have to come to a global ethic that we should not harm them, we should not kill them. I feel that it is imperative to support grassroots vegan education efforts that will change who we are fundamentally and awaken our compassion for all life on the planet and not rely on fragile legislation, shallow corporate promises. Uh, I do encourage everyone to contact your representatives and encourage them not to support the EATS Act. But I feel, that's important for right now, but there's a bigger picture going on. And I really feel that we've got to shift our consciousness as a society, as a community, and support grassroots efforts that do that, that help to create that change. Just some food for thought about this very concerning issue of the EATS Act. So let's now move into our interview for the day. Just a warning, there are descriptions of animal suffering in this episode, as well as mentions of suicide. If you need to talk to someone, the National Suicide and Crisis Hotline is 988. All right, today on the podcast, we have JH Burnett. He has a master's degree in organizational leadership. He majored in life coaching. He spent many years in animal farming, working on his family's sheep farm in South Africa, as well as in the dairy industry. And those experiences sent JH into a deep depression, and he left farming, dedicated himself to animal liberation, recently released a vegan memoir, and is offering services as a life coach. I can't wait to hear all about this. Welcome to the podcast, JH.
I hope. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the kind introduction. This is a massive honor to be on the podcast.
Wonderful. Well, you are our first guest from South Africa, so that's really amazing. Recently, we had someone from India, now from South Africa. I love to see that vegan is spreading around the world. Incredible. So you were in the farming sector for much of your younger life, and I know that you worked on your family's sheep farm. Tell us about all that. Give us your background and your years in farming. I'm curious to hear how all that happened.
So, my family owns a farm in South Africa, right? In what we call the Great Karoo, which is like a semi-desert area, right at the core, at the heart of South Africa, almost close to the middle of it, near a small rural town called Kolfinia. What makes this farm truly unique is that it's the oldest family-owned farm in all of South Africa, right? It's been in our family for 253 years. So I didn't grow up on the farm. I grew up on another family farm about 6 hours away. But I remember going there quite often and going there, and you're surrounded with family members who almost brainwash you as a child in believing that this is the best farm in all of South Africa, which it really isn't. But
Yeah.
we grew up believing that it is, and farming it would be like the ultimate honor, an honor of a lifetime, right? And I remember always as a kid wanting to farm there. I ended up farming on another farm, the one that I grew up on, which was an olive farm, but always a longing to farm the sheep farm in the Great Karoo, right? Wanting to be a part of that history almost. So, but it was never on the cards for me to farm it. I was sort of born into the wrong side of the family, if I can call it so, the black sheep. Lo and behold, life has a way of surprising you. By the turn of 2018, early 2018, I was approached by some family members asking me whether my wife and I would give up everything and move to this farm and almost become the future of it, because it has many shareholders, but we had plans in mind to sort of narrow down and what this move would have meant for us and for the family at large is that I would have taken over ownership 2 years down the line. So they said, would you be willing to move there and go learn from your grandfather and then take over the farm from him in either 2 or 2.5 years' time? So my wife and I absolutely leaped at the opportunity. As I said, it was a massive dream of mine. So I left everything behind and I moved to the crew. My wife stayed behind at the time because she still had a business in our hometown of Worcester, which she still needed a couple of months to close that down. But me and my two bull terriers, the dogs, we moved to the crew almost immediately. So excited to be a part of this, of history almost, right? So that's how I initially ended up in the meat industry in 2018. So I went into it, both my wife and I, having no problem with the fact that obviously it was a sheep farm. We knew that going in, and we had no problem with it because obviously we weren't vegans. We were full on meat eaters. At the time, I mean, I had no vegan background. At the time, being 29 years old, I'd never even met another vegan or a vegan, right? Because of course I wasn't. So I went into, I'm going to now be a sheep farmer. Of course, I had no idea what I was doing, and I was sort of going in with the mindset that I'm going to take over this farm in 2.5 years' time. So I'm just going to be like the silent observer for the first couple of months. I'm going to learn all there is to learn, hopefully get good at it, get skilled at it, and so I can take over the farm in 2 or 2.5 years' time. So what happened was literally as of day one, it just wasn't a good fit because I made what I now call the vegan connection. And there were certain instances on the farm where I just made that vegan or that love connection. I saw certain things, it didn't make sense on a moral level, challenged it. I wasn't happy with the answers that I got, both my wife and I, and that led us to veganism. So maybe I can start off with a story, right? So literally on the first morning on the job, they took me to a sheep pen where they worked, quote unquote, with the sheep, right? So what they were doing on that specific morning is they were docking the baby lambs. Now, docking in this context means the cutting off of their tails.
Mm.
So I remember standing there, as I said, the silent observer, just learning on the job. And I was just absolutely horrified by this process because there were these big guys holding down these tiny, small, innocent little lambs and cutting off their tails with a pair of blunt, old, rustic garden scissors, of all things, right?
Oh, oh
And
no.
if these lambs could talk, man, they would have been like, "What are you doing to me, man?" Because
Mm.
they were crying, obviously, almost begging for the pain to stop, and they were bleeding quite severely. It was absolutely horrific to see it. And that same late afternoon, right by dusk, I had been walking with this sight playing over and over in my mind the entire day, and I decided to drive out to the field to just go check up on these lambs because I was worried, for their safety. Although the guys working there said, no, they'll be fine. It's the way of the land. But I just wanted to go check for myself. And arriving at the herd in the field, I found two little lambs, weak and frail, who were bleeding profusely. They were so weak that they couldn't walk anymore, right? They could hardly stand up. They tried to get up and then they would fall down again. And it just broke my heart. And I decided, man, I can't leave them here. I got to take them home with me. And so I did. And I took them literally into my house, and I made a nice little bed for them on the kitchen floor, put down some blankets and some pillows, and I treated their wounds to the best of my abilities, and I fed them some nice formula milk, and I just sat with them for the most of the evening, just loving on them, right? And looking into their eyes, I made that vegan love connection. I just realized in that moment that these beings are sentient. I could see I could see love in their eyes. And I knew in that moment, I mean, of course, they can feel fear. They can also feel hope, and they're finding hope within me now. But these are sentient beings, and sitting there with them that evening, I remember thinking of my two dogs who were literally next door, only separated with a single door, right? And I thought of my two dogs, and I thought of how it felt to me, at least in that moment, like I was willing to lay my life down for these two dogs. I love them so much, right? But what's the difference between these two dogs of mine and these two little innocent lambs? How can I love the dogs but eat the lamb? Right. So that was the first vegan connection. And I went to bed that night, woke up the next morning, and unfortunately, cruel as life can be, they had both passed in the night.
Oh,
Absolutely broke my heart. And I phoned my wife and I told her of the whole story, and she was weeping over the phone, and I was crying. And so that was
oh,
sort of the start of my journey on the farm. So it sort
oh,
of started off on that trend, and then like a week or two later, I remember sitting on the back porch early one morning and just looking at the sunrise, taking a moment almost to focus my mind and get ready for the day. Because at that time I was already severely troubled by the atrocities that I witnessed in the industry on the farm, although it was only like 2 weeks into my journey. And I was sitting there with a nice cup of coffee and my two bull terriers. And one of the guys who worked on the farm came walking past my yard, and we greeted one another. And then he wandered off to what we called the sick pen. Is basically a small little pen where we kept lambs who had lost their mothers, because often the mother would pass away, or she would have twins and she wouldn't have enough milk for both, and then one of the lambs would end up in the sick pen, right? So I was sitting there in the back porch. I saw this guy walk into the sick pen. Then I saw him moments later come out dragging a lamb by its hind legs. And I remember thinking, my goodness, shame, this poor lamb must have died in the evening. And this guy is sort of just carrying it out. And then I saw, no, this lamb is still very much alive and kicking and trying to get out of this guy's grasp, right? And I sort of sat forward thinking, what on earth is this guy doing? And the next moment, he picked up a massive rock
oh.
and he
No.
started, yeah, it breaks one's heart just talking
Oh,
about it, but
uh,
he started beating down on this poor innocent little lamb, and I just jumped up and ran for all my life. And almost like a poorly made horror film, I couldn't get the garden gate open, and I eventually
oh,
got out, and I'm running and I'm screaming like, stop, stop, stop. And whether this guy just couldn't hear me or refused to do so, I still don't know to this day. But eventually I reached him and I just leaped at him and pushed him off with all my might. And I remember holding this small, frail, bleeding little lamb as it literally breathed its last breath, and just sitting there heartbroken, just saying over and over and again, like, why? I couldn't stop asking that simple question, why, for
mm.
at least the next 10 minutes, sitting there in the desert sand with this bleeding lamb. Again, that love connection was made, and there was just no return after that.
Ooh, wow. That's really, really heartbreaking stuff. We know as vegans, we know these things go on these farms. That's why we're vegan. But to hear it, to hear someone who actually lived through it, that you were there, you witnessed these things firsthand. Whew, it's so intense. If we could, I really want to, if you would explain why they cut the tails off with the docking, just so people understand. I mean, it's not just that they cut the tails off because, you know,
Sure.
there is a reason, but it's all kind of connected to how you have to have these kind of inherent cruelties to make a
Of course.
profit, right? To
Of
farm.
course.
And then also probably why they killed this little lamb is, there's a cost effectiveness. Is like, are we going to waste feed on a little sick lamb? It costs too much money, right? So there's Even though it seems very sadistic and cruel, which it is, certainly, there are economic reasons. And so that's why, in a way, it's inherent cruelty. And even if you don't want to do these certain things, that's inherent in farming, right? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Of course, of course. It really does all come down to finances. These sheep or cows or chickens are simply money-making machines to farmers. Regards to the docking, they cut off the tails to prevent the sheep's dung to get stuck between its tail and its anus, right? And obviously, because sheep has wool,
The
they
waste, the
the
waste.
waste the
Yeah.
waste gets
Mhm.
stuck in the wool around the anus, and when they have tails, it sort of makes it easier for the waste to get stuck there, which then could cause infections, or the flies will gather there and start laying eggs and so forth. So that's why sheep farmers will tell you, but it's for in the best interest of the sheep. However, it all boils down to finances. I promise you, I write about it extensively in my book. It really comes back to it is really in the best interest of the farmer.
Yeah.
That's what it all boils down to. All
Yeah.
the practices on the farm, it's for profit.
Right, right. And these sheep have been so genetically manipulated that the skin is so thick and wrinkly on all over their body so that there's more wool to cut. And so that's why that matting happens. It doesn't happen, to animals in nature regularly that, the waste would get matted in the wool. But because they've been so genetically manipulated, it's worse, that matting that happens. And then fly strike can happen where the flies lay the eggs. There can be open wounds. It can get very, like you said, infected, but can also be very painful for them. And so then, right, like you said, they will say, well, we have to cut the tails off so that the animal's more comfortable, or for the betterment of the animal. But it wouldn't be that way. Like, the whole situation would not occur if they hadn't been so genetically manipulated to have all that wool matted around their rump, right? So, yeah,
Help you. You've absolutely struck the nail on the head. I couldn't
yeah,
have put it better. That's exactly the case.
yeah. So how long did you stay on this farm? Because I think you stayed for a while, right? What kept you there?
Yes. Great question. I love this question. It's so part of my journey. I love answering it because many people can ask, and I have been asked before. But JH, if you were so traumatized by it, because I really was, that's where the depression initially kicked in for me, was because of the atrocities that I witnessed in the sheep farming industry. Why didn't you leave, JH, or why didn't you leave sooner? Three reasons, right? The first one is that I didn't want to give up the farm, right? I had a vision of turning it into a sanctuary, right? Of course, not when I went there initially, but within the first couple of weeks, I started reading up on veganism, realized that, of course, sanctuaries exist across the world, and I would love to turn this farm, after 250 years at that time of bloodshed in the sheep industry, it's my dream now to turn it into a sanctuary. But if I leave now, I'm giving up the potential of turning it into sanctuary.
Mm,
So there was that. The
okay.
second fact is what sort of made it easier for me to hang around is that we also had a small the pecan nut sector on the farm, about 20 hectares.
I'm sorry, a
So I
what?
ended, you know what pecans are?
Oh,
The nuts.
pecans. Okay,
Oh,
right.
you see, we pronounce it differently. Okay, brilliant,
Well,
brilliant,
and
brilliant. You see, it's the different continents. Brilliant.
right. Well, actually,
Pecans,
even
pecans.
even here in the US, some people say pecans and others say
I see.
pecans. And it's kind of
Okay,
regional.
there you go. Okay,
More in the
okay.
south of the US, they say pecans, and that's where I'm from. So I always
Brilliant.
say pecans. But yeah, okay.
Pecans. Okay, so we had pecans on the farm. So I basically said they needed some help because the pecans was in a horrendous state. So I said, guys, I have a lot of knowledge of irrigation systems, so I will do it, right? So I ended up spending 70% of my time over the next couple of years working in that sector of the farm. While obviously, of course, I couldn't avoid the sheep farming component entirely. However, it sort of did help me survive mentally. And then the third thing was that my wife and I, within the first couple of months of us moving to the farm, started a small unofficial sanctuary on the farm where we could take care of animals because the sheep unfortunately weren't ours to save, if that makes sense, right? I was only one of the managers on the farm. They belonged to certain shareholders and so forth, but I could still save animals. I could still start a small little, as I said, unofficial sanctuary on the farm. So how that started is actually a beautiful little story. So I remember late one afternoon, I got a phone call from one of the neighbors, and he was in the process of moving away, right? And he said, "Listen, JH, I'm moving much sooner than I initially thought I would, and I'm not going to have time to come say goodbye. So I thought I'd just give you a call and say thanks for everything. Hopefully see you soon, but we're off in the morning." So I've thanked him for the call, and we shared a couple of thoughts. And then as I was about to put down the phone, I almost got like what I call like a ping from the universe, right? And as I was about to put down the phone, I said, "What, what, 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 what?" And he was like, "What is it?" And I said, I remember last time I was there on your farm, you had these three little Indian runner ducks. Now, I hope I'm not sure. Have you ever seen an Indian runner duck?
I have no idea what that is.
You should Google it, and so
Okay.
should the listeners. It is the cutest thing alive,
Oh.
right? Yeah. So I said, I remember you had these three little Indian runner ducks, a white one, a brown one, and a black one. I said, what's going to happen to them? And he said, funny you should ask. I gave them to the guys who worked for me, and they had just come to collect them from me. And they're on their way back now to the one guy's house to slaughter them for supper. Can you believe it?
Oh.
Right? And I said, not on my watch.
Uh,
Said, I am coming immediately. So I left everything and I just got in the car and rushed over there as fast as I could. We drove up to the one guy's house. They wouldn't give them to me, right? They said, no, it's theirs. This farmer gave them to them and they're going to eat them and so forth. And I said, listen, I'll buy them from you. So I ended up buying these free runner ducks, took them home with me, and that's how our little sanctuary started. And my wife and I
wow.
told one another, we're not going to go look for animals. The right animals will find us.
Yeah.
And hope, we blinked twice and we had 55 animals living in our backyard. I think that's sort of the story of all sanctuaries, right?
Yep.
So we had 55 animals living there, and caring for those animals also helped me with the insanity that was happening around me. Having the vision of turning this small little sanctuary of 55 animals into a much larger one 2 or 3 years down the line. That's what kept me there. And it took me I spent 3 years on the farm, but finally, by the advent of COVID, it got so dry in the Karoo. This is the area where we farmed, that the shareholders were no longer making money from farming of the sheep. So some of them sort of backpedaled and said, no, we want to go back on this deal that we had with UJH. We would much rather sell off the farm. And other shareholders took offense. Some wanted to sell, others didn't want to anymore. And they ended up taking one another to court. And they finally said, we think we should just rent out the farm. Everybody should go, everybody working here, everybody managing it, including my wife and I. You guys should go. We need to settle this in court. And that's how my wife and I end up leaving the farm 3 years later, horrified, especially now. Of course, by then the depression was severe, having witnessed, just the blood and the gore for 3 years, and now having to give up, as I said, at the height of COVID, having to give up the animals that you love and having to rehome them to other sanctuaries and to people we trusted. So that entire process was heart wrenching. But that was basically a long way for me to answer your question of how long I stayed there, why I stayed so long, and how I was eventually forced off of the land, and how the sanctuary dream was halted. It's not
Mm.
over. It's not over, but it was definitely halted.
And I know that you then somehow ended up in the US, right? And you continued to work in the industry. What happened
What a crazy
next?
story. I just want to say quickly that my wife and I gave up eating meat on the same day that I saw that tiny lamb being basically mauled to death by that guy with the large rock. We gave
Really?
up eating meats, but we never called ourselves vegans, well, at least not for the next couple of years, because I was still paid off of the backs of these sheep, right? I was still working in the sheep industry. So we didn't feel worthy of the vegan title, if I can put it so, but we
Mm.
were full on plant based for the
Huh.
animals. So we were vegan technically for the largest part of the time that I spent working on the sheep farm.
Yeah.
And as I said, eventually we were forced off of the land. And to answer your question, wow, what a crazy story how I ended up in the US. I was scrolling through Facebook and I reconnected with an old friend of mine. He mentioned that he was now living in the US and that he was recruiting South African guys to go work for a specific farmer in North Dakota. He had no idea about my circumstances and that we were sort of in dire straits because we had lost everything. Because I'm not taking pride in this. This is not us being good. It's just the way that life was. But we ended up spending basically all our savings in rehoming the animals in the
Oh,
sanctuary and paying for feed for a year in
yeah.
advance
Oh, wow.
for all of them. So we had nothing left, right? But this guy had no idea of our personal circumstances. He just said, "Listen, JH, would you be interested in coming, to come work on this farm?" And of course, I said we were in dire straits, and I just said, "Okay, I guess this is what I need to do." But connect me with the farmer. The farmer and I had a nice conversation, and I specifically asked this gentleman whether there are any animals on the farm, right? Because, as you can imagine, at this time, I mean, I was so sick of the animal agricultural industry. So I just didn't want any part of it. And I remember this guy telling me, not unless you count the dog. That's what he said,
Uh,
right? So I ended up going there. And
moving
when
all
we
the way to the
drove into
US for this job.
moving all the way
Oh,
to the US to go work on this farm
wow.
in North Dakota, left
Uh-huh.
my wife behind, moved there by myself. And when we drove into this guy's farm, there was a massive feedlot hosting more than 2,000 dairy cows.
Oh.
And I initially thought this must be the neighbors because this
Mm.
guy said not unless you count the dog. But no, no, no. This feedlot was and is very much part of his farm and
Okay.
his daily operations. And I was absolutely appalled by that. At first, I didn't work with the cows on that feedlot. I had a different job, right? But just seeing from a distance the atrocious conditions that these cows were living in. I mean, to give you an idea, well, my first Sunday there, I was given the afternoon off, and the whole week I'd seen dead cows spread throughout the feedlot, literally lying dead among their friends and family. I mean, their friends and family are literally trampling them into the dirt, right?
Mm.
And it bothered me so much. I asked the guy who ran the feedlot at the time, when are you going to take him out? And he sort of took offense, with the question that I posed. And he swore and he said, never, right? Never, I'm never taking them out. They can trample them into the dirt for all I care. So
Right.
I asked the farmer on that Sunday that I had the afternoon off. I said, do you mind if I take the skid steer? You don't have to pay me, but I can I just take these cows out? If you don't mind, just give them a proper burial. He said, no, you can't bury them. You can take them out, but you need to put them almost in a heap, next to the feedlot. And this was very traumatic. These cows, shame, they had severed limbs, they had crushed skulls,
Mm.
many of them were trampled to semi-mince. It was an absolute horrendous scene, and I piled them up, and I was crying the whole time. It just absolutely broke my heart. And as I walked away, the farmer called me, said, JH, you need to go back because they have tags in the ears, which has numbers on them. He said, you need to go take photos of all of their tags so that we can know which cows you took out of the feedlot, right? And I said, but they all piled up. How am I going to get them? We said, basically, just make a plan. So see me literally climbing and clawing through deceased cows, rotting away, trying to take photos of their tags. And I'm just crying. And I'm thinking, what horrible species am I a part of? What are we doing to these poor animals?
Mm.
So that's how my journey started in the
Wow.
US. And I'm thinking, how am I gonna get home? I've got no money to my name. If I don't work this month, then my wife and I don't eat, basically.
Mm.
So I made the horrendous decision to stay. And what was so most horrific about it is that involved artificially inseminating a large portion of those cows on a daily basis, up to about 50, sometimes 60 cows per day.
Wow. And this reminds me of how probably the majority of people that work in this industry, that work at the feedlots, that work at the slaughterhouses, they don't want to be there. This is horrible work. And you kind of have to turn your heart off to be able to continue to work in that industry. You probably were going through what a lot of people go through, that you just don't have a choice. You
Sure.
have to do it. It's awful. Um,
Sure, sure, sure. No, no, you're absolutely right. I am positive that at least 99% of the people working in these industries don't want to be there and simply
mm,
feel they have no choice, as I did at the time.
yeah.
Being vegan already at the time, I really felt it. It was immensely tough for me. I remember going to the cows every morning, like half an hour before the job officially started, and just go in there. And they are such gentle creatures. They are so curious and so loving. And despite the abuse that they're going through, and the abuse that's awaiting them, they just love you, man. I would just stand there with them, and they would encircle me and just start sniffing at me. And it's almost like it's the gentlest approach, right? It's almost like little kisses. They are such loving animals. And eventually
Mm.
I started playing football with them, right? Or
Oh.
soccer. I don't know what you
Uh-huh,
call it
uh.
in the States.
Mhm.
And if you've ever seen happiness, right? Happiness manifests. It's a bunch of cows playing football, right? Or chasing or jumping around and having the time of their lives.
Aw.
But going through that AI, artificial insemination process, doing that to those innocent, loving creatures, that haunts me still. It really
Mm,
does. It's the stuff
mm,
of nightmares, and I
yeah.
mean that
Oh,
literally. It kept me awake.
oh,
Sometimes it still does. I still wake up in a cold sweat at least once a month, dreaming that I'm back in that feedlot. Um,
oh, gosh,
Absolutely horrendous.
awful. So on this dairy farm, you had to do artificial insemination, and I'd really like to hear about that, about your experience. I've done research on this and I've seen videos, and it really just seems awful, so invasive. Please tell us about artificial insemination.
So invasive is really putting it lightly. It's exploitation of the worst degree. So for those of you who don't know, basically what it is, and it really does break my heart even just talking about it now, but for the sake of the conversation, I don't mind sharing. So what it's all about, how it works is you get what they call an AI gun, right? Artificial insemination gun. And within this gun is basically just a long tube, but within this tube is the bull semen, which was also immorally obtained. So you take this AI gun and you literally press or hold it to the cow's vulva, who is at this stage caught in a headlock, caught to a point where she can basically not move because she
Right.
would never have
Restrained.
allowed you restrained. There's the word that I
Yeah.
was looking
Yeah.
for. So she needs to be restrained for this process to work successfully because she would never allow anybody to exploit her in this manner if she wasn't restrained, right? So then you take the AI gun and you press it into the cow's vulva. And then with your other hand, you literally force it into her anus, of all things. And then from inside the cow's anus, you then take the tip of the AI gun and you start maneuvering it ever deeper into the cow's vagina with your one arm sliding basically ever deeper into the cow's anus, all the way sometimes to your elbow, which is absolutely horrific if you think how big a grown man's arm can be, right?
Mm.
And then finally, when you reach the cervix, you sort of manipulate it until the cervix opens for you to insert the AI gun into the cervix, and then you release the bull semen into the cow's cervix, and the process is complete, and that cow will then be pregnant.
Mm. Yeah, I've seen videos of this and just having so often they'll put some kind of a plastic sleeve on their hand and then inserting their arm into her, into her anus. It's oh, I can't even imagine first just how disgusting all this is. I mean, just that's kind of one level, just
Of course.
the gross factor, that this is how we're producing our food, you know? It's like, what?
Sure.
Uh, but then if you think about, that happening in your body and how and for these cows, I mean, she doesn't know what's happening. She doesn't know what's going on. It's got to be so just I've called it before. I think it's like a cow's Me Too moment. I mean, it's really a sexual
Wow.
violation. It's a sexual violation.
Is well put. A cow's Me Too moment.
Yeah.
Yes. As I said, it's exploitation of the worst degree.
Yeah. And you didn't really mention anything about calves. And of course, the dairy cows have to be pregnant. That's what the artificial insemination is
Sure.
for them to get pregnant so that they produce the
Sure.
milk. What happened to the calves or the babies? Did you see what happened?
Sure. So at this specific feedlot, the cows at this feedlot didn't give birth at the feedlot itself. So about 3 weeks before they were due to give birth, because I really do keep track of their pregnancy cycles and so forth, they would be shipped off or taken away
Really?
to
Okay.
the dairies, and that's where they would give
Um,
birth. At the dairies, obviously, they would give birth there, and then that's where their babies would be taken from them. However, 2 months later, those same babies would be shipped back to this feedlot. So I saw
oh,
many young calves come into the feedlot at 2 months old, right?
okay.
Many of them, shame, they wouldn't survive the first. Many of them would die of disease and the cold. I mean, you can imagine the North Dakota winter. These small little calves, 2 months old, they get dropped off there in their hundreds at a time, and many of them would just pass away within the first couple of days. So I
Oh,
wasn't part of the process of the, if I can call it now, and I want to call it the stealing of the babies,
yeah.
which is absolutely horrific,
Yeah.
but that didn't take place at this specific
Okay. So this
feedlot.
was like a breeding, just kind of breeding
That's
feedlot.
right.
Yeah. And all those babies that came back were just the females. Where were the males? There would be just as
Oh,
many
of
males.
course, of
Yeah.
course, of
Yeah.
course, of course. I almost don't have to answer it. It almost goes without saying that they would have been, most of them, 99% of them would have been slaughtered by then.
Right.
So absolutely
Yeah.
horrific.
Yeah.
Absolutely horrific.
So JH, how did you get out of this? How did you get off this dairy farm? What happened next?
So at this point in time, I was severely depressed, right? I struggled to find the will to continue living. And I remember one evening, I walked into the woods on the farm where I was working and living at the time. And I sat by this tiny little creek and I had this old rustic blade. And I just started playing around on my wrist. And I thought, I can just cut off my wrist right now. I've got no will to continue living. I just can't do it. You know, the exploitation of the animals, almost as if I can't cope in a non-vegan world. That's sort
Oh,
of the thoughts that were going through my
wow.
head, right? And in that moment, as life would have it, an enormous, and if I say enormous, I mean gigantic elk of all things came walking down the slope from the opposite side of the creek straight towards me, right? And
Wow.
of course, it was already dark by then. This elk is walking straight towards me, and I'm sitting there in awe. First of all, I've never seen one before in real life, and I'm sitting there thinking, how could he not see me? Surely he must see me. I'm sitting right in front of him, right? And if he can't see me, surely he must be able to smell me. I mean, they can smell, I think, like 1,000 times better than we
Mm,
can.
yeah.
Surely he must smell me. But at second glance, I saw that he had been shot, and he had been shot in the face of all things, in the
No.
bottom jaw, and
Oh,
his entire bottom jaw was dangling in the wind like a
oh,
wet cloth.
no,
So
no.
the entire bottom part of his face was completely just hanging.
Wow.
Horrifying. So I backed away slowly. So this elk was so desperate for water in his dying moments, basically, that he was willing to confront me. He needed to get to that
Mm,
creek. And I'm sitting there thinking, you know, this can't be. How can we as a species be so immensely cruel? And at that moment, he turned around and he walked away slowly. He was about to die, definitely. There was no way he was going to survive that night. And and in that moment, I just found the agency within myself to say, no, JH, your story isn't finished, man. You gotta turn your life around. You gotta stand up for what you believe in. You gotta quit these industries for good. You gotta, as I said, stand up for what you believe in. In that moment, I dedicated my life to the animal liberation cause. I never went back to work. I resigned the next morning. And 3 days later, I ended up flying back to South Africa. This was middle of 2021. And coming home was just so liberating. And then obviously our vegan journey officially started because
mm,
now I wasn't paid off of the backs of innocent animals anymore. I could live a loud and proud vegan life. But just one last thing
yeah.
of leaving the feedlot, my last morning on the farm when I resigned and I was about to leave, just spending time with those cows for all time's sake, it just broke my heart because I could leave, but they couldn't leave. They were stuck there. Their fates were sealed. I could still go, but they had nowhere to go. There was no salvation on the horizon. And I remember leaving there, driving off at the farm while I was given a lift to the airport, just weeping once more, just weeping for these innocent lives exploited day in and day out. So I got to leave. They never got to leave, but they helped me to find my voice so I can be a voice for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is how my journey played out to where I'm at now.
Wow, that's just so sad. And the elk, what a powerful story that in the middle of you actually contemplating whether you even want to be alive to continue, that this elk, I mean, it's almost like he was telling you, look, I'm dying. I have to go, but you don't. You can stay and you can fight for us. Whoa,
It
it's
still
so,
drives me to tears ever so often. Even sitting here talking about it now,
yeah,
I'm quite emotional just thinking back on that night.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm immensely grateful for that moment and for it
Wow.
having led me on this vegan journey.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're seeing this more and more. I hear of stories of farmers making these connections, having these awakenings, turning things around. So I do believe it is happening more and more. You know, as vegans, we so often get accused of, well, you don't know anything about farming, or they'll say opposition or farmers or anyone will say, well, you don't know animals, you don't know about farming, how can you speak to this? But you know, you've been there, you've lived it, and that's so
Mm.
powerful. It's wonderful that you can actually speak to it truly, and tell these stories.
Thank you so much. Yes, I also see it like that, and it's just a massive honor to add my voice to that conversation because, as you said, all too often we almost the vegan activist being put in a bad light, painted in a bad light, saying that you have no idea what you're talking about, you don't understand, you don't come from a farming background. And
Yeah.
I'm so fortunate now, so I don't necessarily even regret the fact that I lived that journey, because now I can add my voice to it. So yes,
Yeah,
it's a massive honor to be a part of the conversation.
that's right. So what are you up to now? Tell us where this has taken you, what your vegan journey is looking like now.
Okay, so when I came back home, I started writing my vegan memoir, right? And it was a quite a tough thing to do, to relive all those stories, all those, absolute atrocities.
Mm,
So I had to take a lot of breaks. And in those breaks, I wanted to do something fun and something fresh and something almost lighthearted. So I started writing vegan children's novels.
mm,
So the next, let's say, between coming home and now, for the next 2 years, I wrote my vegan memoir. I wrote several vegan children's books, helping hopefully, to inspire the young ones to go or remain vegan for the animals. And I also started a life coaching practice because originally I did a master's degree and I was fortunate enough to do it in life coaching, not knowing, or majoring in life coaching, not knowing that it would help me down the line. As Steve Jobs said, that you can't connect the dots of your life looking forward. But if you look back, I can now clearly see, all those dots are connected. Perhaps there was a reason why I had to do that specific course, that I can now help people in dire straits mentally. So I am using those skills to help vegans to survive the atrocities and the dark realities of a non-vegan world. So I started a life coaching practice specifically aimed at the vegan market to help people from a life coaching perspective. And then, as I said, spend a lot of time writing and rewriting my vegan memoir, and doing these children's books. And that opened a couple of incredible doors for both my wife and I. My wife, Elle, a beautiful soul, very creative. She was so inspired by the first vegan children's book that I wrote, called Freya and the King, that she said, no, I don't want anyone else to illustrate this book. I want to do it myself. So she spent the next 6 months training herself to do digital illustrations. So she's now illustrating all of these vegan, colorful books. And doing that has opened doors in some brilliant collaboration in opportunities in the vegan space for Ella and myself. We're in the process now of setting up a vegan educational program in South Africa, because it really does feel like we are way behind a large part of the world when it comes to vegan education. So we've started that movement, and as I said earlier, we're in ongoing negotiations to get the land back in the Karoo to start the
right.
sanctuary.
Mm,
So,
yeah. Yeah.
so there's a lot keeping us busy in the
Good.
vegan space. Yes.
So I before I let you go, I did want to ask you about the humane hoax. Of course, this is something that I'm very into. We have our humane hoax project, humanehoax.org. So we have a website for this concept and this issue. And I've, of course, written a couple books on it as well. And because you were in the farming world and that you actually worked in the farming sector, I wonder if you could talk about this because you probably know and saw the reality of humane labeling, the reality that the industry hides behind, the marketing and labels. Can you talk about this a bit?
First of all, I must say I am massively impressed with the humane hoax. I was only recently introduced to it, and I love especially the fact that there are so many people collaborating on it.
Yeah.
And I really do believe, cliche as it may well sound, that we are stronger together. So I love the fact that you guys are all collaborating on it. Absolutely love it. And I
Thanks.
also love the fact that I love the word hoax. It's so beautifully put. And it really is a hoax, the humane labeling of it all. I can only speak to my personal experience, especially in the dairy industry, having seen the atrocities of the industry, the two worlds, you can't really bring them together. If I walk into my local supermarket, I see all these humane labels of these happy cows, getting to live the best lives imaginable. I mean, they're rolling around in the grass and they are jumping over rainbows, but that is not the reality. All I can say is watch the documentaries, educate yourself, read the books, listen to the activists, have a look for yourself. I promise you, it is as Hope would call it. It's a humane hoax. It's
Mhm.
not real. It's a joke. It's how they can get away with it in the 21st century is I just can't get my head around it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, JH, we do need to wrap up. This has all been really just so powerful to hear your story. But I want to ask you our last question. What gives you hope for the future?
Great question. As I said earlier, I am very hopeful, and one needs to be, in a non-vegan world. It's the only way we're going to survive it. People give me hope. More and more people are going vegan every day. Yeah, I believe it's one of the fastest growing movements across the entire world, and my inbox, my personal inbox, email inbox testifies to that. People sharing their hopeful stories. And I want to encourage, please, your listeners, if you'd like to share your vegan story, you want to reach out, please do so. I'd love to hear from you. People are reaching out from all over, and with the most inspiring vegan tales, driving me to tears more often than not. So I can just see, I'm just looking at the facts that yes, there is so much that we can be negative about in this non-vegan world, but my goodness, if we'll only look, there's so much positivity happening, so many new vegans coming into the movement with hope and enthusiasm, and I think we can just continue building on this tremendous vegan foundation and just spread the love more and more so every day.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm so glad that you were able to kind of get out of the farming and empower yourself to do this work. I'm so grateful that you found that courage within to do that. I know that your memoir just came out, so tell us how we can get it. I know that it's an is it like it's an ebook, right? Tell us how our listeners can find it, and we'll put a link in the show notes. But if you want to mention something about it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I try to keep the title as simple and as self-explanatory as humanly possible. So it's called Ex Farmer Goes Vegan, and is currently only available as an ebook. And you can get it from our website, veganismhaswon.com. And the memoir is absolutely free. We're not looking to make money from it. We just want to share the vegan love to as many people as possible. So please go and get the book from our websites at no cost to you, and share the love.
Oh, I love it. Well, thank you, JH, so much for joining us. Thank you for all that you're doing and for having the awakening that you had. And yeah, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a massive honor. Thank you so much, Hope.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. This episode was so powerful. Hearing JH's story of actually working in this industry, going through severe depression, having an awakening that this is all so cruel and horrible, and then to come out the other side vegan and an animal advocate. It's an incredible story. I really want to share it with everyone, so please help me do that. Share this episode with your networks, with your friends, with your family. It's an important one for everyone to hear. And just to end on a positive note, our Ahimsa Vegan Conference that happened the last weekend of August was really wonderful, so successful. We actually had 500 people register for that event. And there was a temple, a Jain temple in Chicago that live streamed it. So much wonderful feedback. The Q&A chat was just going strong the entire time. It was hard to keep up with. So much enthusiasm and interest. It was incredible. What a wonderful weekend. So, we're editing the videos now. I'll let you know when those are available, and maybe you can watch a panel or a presentation from our Ahimsa Vegan Conference. It was really inspirational. There was so much support, and I appreciate your support of this podcast. Thank you for listening. Share this episode and live vegan.